But the war also had another, more subtle result that often gets left out of the story. It helped launch one of the biggest cultural revolutions of the 20th century. That's right. The Vietnam War played a huge part in kickstarting the hippie movement. Your host, and you're watching this channel. We think of hippies today as flower children who advocated peace, loved man, experimented with drugs, and made some pretty questionable fashion choices. But their emergence as a cultural force was actually born out of the horrors of war. In the 1960s, two major conflicts dominated global news: the civil rights movement in America and the war in Vietnam. And while they're often discussed separately, these events were actually deeply intertwined. In fact, it was the civil rights movement that first made peace and anti-war activism popular. When Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and his associates began protesting the brutal realities of Jim Crow laws, they drew a lot of attention from young people. For the first time, the idea of nonviolent resistance to authority became a cool thing, especially among young white Americans who hadn't experienced the same level of oppression as Black Americans, but still wanted to make a difference. This idea of nonviolent activism would become key to the hippie movement. And when the U.S. started ramping up its involvement in the Vietnam War in the mid-1960s, many of these same young people turned their activist energies to ending America's military campaign overseas. To them, the war was morally indefensible. Not only did the U.S. not have a real reason for being there, they argued, but its presence was causing untold death and suffering among Vietnamese civilians. You might remember that America's involvement in the Vietnam War started small, starting in the early 1950s. Under President Dwight D. Eisenhower, the U.S. sent military advisors to South Vietnam to help out that country's government against a communist-backed insurgency. By the early 1960s, though, President John F. Kennedy and then Lyndon B. Johnson had significantly increased the number of U.S. troops in Vietnam, using them to try to prevent the spread of communism. By 1967, around 500,000, American men and women were fighting in the dense jungles and verdant rice paddies of Vietnam. The problem was that despite all those soldiers and all their firepower, the U.S. was stuck in a stalemate. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army were elusive and tenacious opponents, willing to use unconventional tactics like booby traps, hidden explosives, snipers, and guerrilla attacks to wear down the Americans. And even worse, every day more and more young Americans were coming home from the war, dead or wounded. As tens of thousands of American coffins started showing up on the doorsteps of grieving families, it became harder and harder to justify the war to the public. A growing number of Americans began to wonder why their children and grandchildren were dying in such a faraway and strange land. Enter the hippies. They had their own reasons for opposing the war. Many of them didn't buy into the domino theory that U.S. policymakers had used to justify their intervention. This was the idea that if one Southeast Asian country fell to communism, then the rest would follow like a row of dominoes. Hippies also saw through what they considered the hypocrisy of the U.S. government. At the time, the U.S. was a nuclear powerhouse, with its sights set on putting a man on the moon. Yet it couldn't seem to solve problems back on Earth, like poverty, racial inequality, and the war in Vietnam. But perhaps most important of all, hippies simply couldn't wrap their heads around a war that seemed pointless and cruel. For one thing, the U.S. wasn't fighting a conventional enemy. Much of the warfare in Vietnam was happening in civilian areas where bombs, rockets, and napalm often killed or injured non-combatants. For another, it seemed as if no matter how many resources the U.S. threw at the problem, the war just dragged on. It was during this period that hippies really came into their own. They were mostly young people, typically under 30, though the movement did have older adherents, and they tended to be white middle-class kids who could afford to drop out of school or career. They lived communally and rejected traditional gender roles. Women wore their hair long, and both men and women donned tie-dye shirts, jewelry made from natural materials, and headbands. They took their name from the Spanish word hippie, which is slang for hepcat, a trendy person in the know. The term hippie was coined in the late 1940s by jazz musicians, who were looking for a word that captured the Beat Generation's sense of cool and irony. And by the mid-1960s, it had caught on with other young activists who were disillusioned with mainstream culture and politics. Now, hippies weren't the only group protesting the Vietnam War. There were plenty of anti-war activists who didn't live communal lives and wear tie-dye. In fact, Many prominent anti-war activists like Muhammad Ali, the boxer, and Daniel Berrigan, the priest, didn't even fit the stereotypical hippie mold. Still, hippies were among the most visible opponents of the war. They organized protests, sometimes violently, like the 1967 riot at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago, where they clashed with police. But they were also known for their nonviolent protests, including the famous 1969 Woodstock Festival, which attracted over 400,000 people to a small farm in Bethel, New York for 3 days of music, art, and peace activism. Many hippies also took their activism to the streets with impromptu sidewalk performances meant to shock passers-by into questioning the war. Some hippies even went to jail rather than be drafted into the military. And hundreds of them traveled to Canada in the late 1960s to protest the war at the border crossings. One of the most well-known hippie activists was Timothy Leary, former Harvard professor who became famous for experimenting with psychedelic drugs like LSD and for urging young people to turn on, tune in, and drop out. Leary was fired from Harvard after just 2 years because his experiments violated university guidelines. He then spent much of the late 1960s traveling around the U.S., giving speeches and organizing protests against the Vietnam War. Leary and others believed that if young people could expand their consciousness through psychedelic drugs, they could see the absurdity of the war more clearly. "We must turn on, and we must do it now," he said in one speech in 1966. Turn on to what? Turn on to the fact that life is wonderful and beautiful, and that our current social and political institutions are deadly sick. Hippies also found common cause with other groups, particularly African Americans, who were also fighting for social change. For many hippies, opposition to the Vietnam War and support for civil rights were two sides of the same coin. After all, both struggles were about challenging authority and working toward a more just world. For Black Americans, the war was a particular sore spot. Many saw it as an example of white Americans' hypocrisy, given that so many of them had fought for civil rights at home while turning around and committing atrocities abroad. One black activist put it this way: "If America can bomb and kill civilians in Vietnam, how safe are we in America?" Unfortunately for hippies and other anti-war activists, their efforts did not end the war. In 1973, the U.S. finally agreed to a ceasefire and withdrew its troops from Vietnam. But by that time, nearly 60,000 American men had died. And many more had been wounded or otherwise affected by their experiences. Meanwhile, the war had also taken a terrible toll on Vietnam itself, killing hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese civilians and leaving the country in ruins. So although the war officially ended in 1975 when North Vietnam took over South Vietnam, the impact of the conflict continued for decades. And yet the hippie movement did accomplish something remarkable. It changed the way Americans viewed their country's role in the world. Before the 1960s, the prevailing attitude was that the U.S. should intervene abroad whenever it could to keep communism in check. After the 1960s, however, Americans had grown weary of foreign interventions, at least for a time. The hippie movement was only one part of this cultural revolution. Other factors included the growing environmental movement and the sexual revolution that challenged traditional ideas about sex and gender roles. Still, hippies played an important role in reshaping American attitudes, and not just about the Vietnam War. As one historian put it, the counterculture created a space where people could imagine alternatives to the way things were. Unfortunately for the hippies, this alternative vision didn't last too long. By the late 1970s, hippies either found success within the mainstream or were co-opted by the very system they sought to change. Still, their influence can be seen in the activism of later generations, which continues to challenge authority and call for peace and justice around the world. So what should we talk about next? Please let us know in the comments and subscribe for new episodes every week.